All right. Welcome, everybody. I am Kathy Klotz-Guest. I am the host of The Blab, and I am the founder of keepingithuman.com. And I am a storyteller. I work with companies and organizations telling their stories. I have a book coming out. Looks like it's on track for June, July. And I'm very excited. It's going to be, just give you a little snippet. It's going to be where business storytelling meets improvisation. So the principles of improvisation, how we tell stories on a stage, how those can infuse and spark and power up business storytelling in a really different way. So that's really the focus of this book. So I'm excited. And we have Karen Deese, and I'm so excited. Yay, Karen. Karen is the founder of Just Story It, and she's the author of Business Storytelling for Dummies. And it is a fabulous book, and I'm so excited that she's here. Yay.
Thanks, Kathy. It's great to be here. It's a lot of fun.
I love having you. And if we can get Jim back, and I'm really excited, let me go ahead and give you a little bit about Jim. Jim Signorelli, he is the author of Story Branding, which is another fabulous book about business storytelling. So if you haven't read it, you should. And he is the founder of Story Lab, story-lab.net. So we hope Jim does call back.
Yes.
I feel bad because this is Jim's first blab, and that's and I feel like it's almost like a fraternity hazing thing. It's like I'm really sorry that this is your first experience with blab, but I know it's there you go. But let's jump on into the topic, and for those people I know who can't be here now, it is being recorded. So again, Send your questions in. So let's jump on in, Karen. The focus here, and I want to give a shout out to Sally Jean because she raised this question on the last blab. And so Sally Jean Fox, thank you. Was a great question. And unfortunately, we had 5 minutes left in the blab. And she asked about storytelling for nonprofits. And yay, good to see you, Sally Jean. And how do we tell stories in a way that honors the donors, the people being helped, the constituents being served by it, and also that honors the evolution of the organization itself. So that was sort of the genesis for this blab. So let's talk about that. But first, let's jump in, and I want to start by who are your favorite nonprofit storytellers, and then let's deconstruct why. Why do they work so well?
Well, one of my favorites for a long time, since they started, has been Kiva.
Ah, yes.
And you're the microlending site, and that is a fabulous nonprofit. And from the very, very beginning, they knew that storytelling was going to be the way that they were going to be successful. And so the way they worked with the stories of their constituents is that they knew that every story that they told had to be, first of all, about them, had to be in their voice, but also the stories needed to build respect. Mm-hmm. So no pity parties here.
Yeah. Right?
And it was all about, oh, hey, I got this microloan, and look at the amazing things that I've been able to do in my life. This is how my life has been transformed because of $25, right, that I received. And that kind of energy, first of all, that kind of focus, and then that kind of energy just snowballed, right? And so within their first year, they were generating millions of dollars in donations that were then these microloans to give to others. So they're one of my favorite. How about you, Kathy?
It's interesting. I love Kiva. I do love it. One of the things I was thinking about was how much I really loved Invisible People, and I loved them from the very beginning. And one of the reasons, there's a couple reasons I really love them, and I love Invisible People TV because the gentleman that really started it was homeless himself. And at one point in his life, and they use media and social media and story in such a profound way to reshape perceptions of what homelessness looks like.
So important.
So important. And it's such a amazing channel and discussion and discourse that they have started. And one of the things that I really love is that talk about great storytelling, that it makes you appreciate that, look, these people, anybody could be homeless due to circumstances beyond their control.
Right.
And there's such a dignity about the way they tell the story that every human has dignity, and there's something about it. You don't feel like they're saying, "Hey, just give us money." They're not. They're saying, "Can you be an advocate?" You don't just have to write a check. Be an advocate. Help in your city with humane policies for dealing with homeless camps. Help with talking to your local legislators. And so there's such a level of advocacy that I think raises the standard for storytelling. So I just think they do a really beautiful job, you know.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Advocacy is so important. Yes. We always think of storytelling with nonprofits around fundraising, but if you're doing your storytelling right, then it can be used in both ways, right? And advocacy, we never want to lose sight of that. Absolutely not.
Jim, if you're able to call in, I see you're back on. Jim, if you're able to dial back in, I'll add you. I'll add you to a seat. So I'm hoping that you've surmounted your technology challenges, and I'm so sorry that that's the first experience that you've had with Lab.
No.
I thought we were going to have as many participants today, almost as a Republican debate. Only we were going to have a lot better discussion of the issues. And unfortunately, because of some technology challenges, but if you get a chance, Jim, to recall in, I'd happily add you. Well, yeah, and the advocacy piece that you were just talking about, Karen, I think that really is a big part of the storytelling that nonprofits need to be doing that not everybody does. I find that really interesting that they'll tell the story and it increases donations, and that's wonderful. That's what we want, but they miss the longer term trajectory, which is to empower people to help tell their story on their behalf.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think some nonprofits, I'm not going to say all of them, but I've seen enough examples of nonprofits who take it upon themselves to tell their constituent stories instead of having the people who use their services actually share their stories.
Yeah.
And so what happens then is that advocacy isn't as powerful as it could be, because the end person, the end user, the person whose life is being changed because of the services of the nonprofit, it's just not happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think they have gotten better. I think a lot of nonprofits have gotten better at that. And that's a really important point. They have gotten better at telling the story of who's being helped and how much. I think what's really interesting is that I see some nonprofits missing out on telling the donor stories, because donors have their own stories of why they donate. Yes. And a lot of donors, and some nonprofits I've seen where a good percent of the donors have been helped by the agency, and that's why they have, when they got on their feet, became donors. Right. And they're missing these success stories from the donor side, and not just the, hey, here's who we're helping, but here's the people who maybe got their footing solidified, and now they're helping other people. And these are really, again, advocate and champion stories that I think need to be told. And sometimes I think it's easy to lose sight of that.
You're exactly right. And I always think of it also in terms of donors will donate if they hear stories of other donors and what those donors' experiences have been with the nonprofit. Yeah. And so you always do want to collect your donor stories and share those just as much as you want to share the stories of the people who you've helped.
Absolutely. Hey, Jim, we see ya. Do you hear us? Do you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can, yes. Yay.
Yay. Yeah, I felt so bad. I'm like, that's not a great first experience on Blab. But
I got a good story out of this, right?
Well, it's a crucible. You're on your journey. Right. You've gone through.
Hi, Karen. How are you?
Well, we're glad to have you, Jim. So tell us, who, is there a nonprofit out there, Jim, that you see that's just doing a fabulous job of storytelling in your opinion?
A nonprofit. That would be my company. No, I'm just kidding. I like, actually, I did some work with them, Mothers Against Drunk Driving.
Oh,
Yeah, they do a really good job, I think, of helping people understand what they're all about. I think a lot of charities, in fact, I just saw an ad this morning. I got one from the Lung Association.
Oh my goodness.
And it was basically, we're raising all kinds of money. Look at all the money that we're raising, and you can be part of this movement. And I don't even know what they do with the money or how it works, but MAD, on the other hand, really goes out of their way to explain what they're doing to help mothers against drunk driving and all of the programs that they have in place to keep people sober on the road. So it's I think that would probably be my favorite.
It's a good one. Yeah, it's a really good one. Welcome, Art. Thanks for joining us. Art Jones has joined us. I'm welcoming all the people jumping on. So welcome. Thanks for joining us today. And that's a really interesting one. And I can't help but think about the evolution of organizations as maybe their mission changes or it adapts to the realities, because I think about MAD and I also think about a similar trajectory that we're seeing now with accidents happening because people are texting. It's not the same thing, but you're seeing now they share a common thing. And you're seeing a lot more accidents happening now because of that. And I wonder to myself, as part of the story and part of the evolution of a nonprofit story, how you make allies and you build a coalition and how you tell that story in a wider net that gets people to understand that maybe, look, your decision making is compromised just when you're drinking, but also when you're distracted and texting, because ultimately we're talking about distracted driving and we're talking about driving that is compromised. So how might nonprofits use storytelling or build a wider story to stay relevant and top of mind when maybe conditions change?
Well, first, I think they have to understand what a story is. Many of them are just providing assertions or opinions about how you should behave or what you should do. I think, they have to understand that a story is really about an event that occurred that resolves some sort of a problem or presents a problem. Starting there, I think that kind of opens the doors for a lot of other things to happen. It allows for a lot more latitude, I guess, in terms of what to come up with and how to communicate it.
Right. I agree. You said another thing, Kathy, when you were talking that really struck me, is that there are a lot of stories that nonprofits could be telling about their partner relationships. And those are not getting told, in really well ways, and it's a missed opportunity, I think. And I'm going to plug in a light. I see I'm sitting in the dark here, so let me just do that.
She is an enlightened woman sitting in the dark.
Right. Let me go fix that.
Yeah. Well, and it's such an important point because I really see so many opportunities for partnership storytelling that doesn't happen. And I think, regardless of what you think about it, I think Black Lives Matter has done an amazing job of storytelling by taking individual stories and tying them to a current kind of feeling and a current environment, a current zeitgeist. And so, some people, I'm not asking you to agree or disagree or whatever, but the way that they tell those stories, I think they do an amazing job because it's such a top of mind kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I've worked with a couple nonprofits, and my sense is, number one, there's a lot of turnover. They're somewhat bureaucratic. And the leadership doesn't really have an appreciation oftentimes for what can be done with storytelling. And until leadership really adopts that as a charge or a cause, it's never really going to happen. I mean, people are just going to go about their own way, doing whatever they're doing without any, thread of consistency. Right. So I think that one of the first things that any nonprofit has to do, is is adopted at the leadership level, adopt storytelling at the leadership level, and have leadership cascade it through the ranks by, number one, helping people understand what a story is, and galvanizing people to collect and share stories within the organization. There's so many stories, it's like oftentimes I refer to it as inside baseball, where the organization, they think, they just assume people know what they're all about, what they're doing, and why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah,
just by virtue of their name. The fact is they don't. And let's face it, every nonprofit is competing for donations, and there's only so many donations that can be made. So the more engaging the story, the more involving, the more emotionally moving the story, the better chance of moving people and motivating people to donate. Relative to competition.
Right. Absolutely. And I'm going to ask a question on behalf of Lynn. Lynn, you asked a great question. Which partner relationships? Well, we're talking in general sort of partners that you might need. And I'll give you an example. So I was at a storytelling conference months ago, and I met a bunch of people from the nonprofit sector. And I got to talking with them about charity water, and they all kind of cringed. They went, And I said, well, what's the story on that? And what I heard was from a lot of people who had been with non-government organizations, NGOs, on the ground in a lot of those places where charity water went into, is that, and I think, to be fair, charity water, I think, has raised their sensitivity about this, and I think they're doing things differently. But they would go into these places where these local government operations were happening and just kind of blaze in, and we're going to save the day. So they really didn't partner very well with their partner organizations. So Lynn, in that example, if you're charity water and you're going into a country, there are already operations there that have already learned the customs, the local government. They understand how to get things done. So you need to partner with those organizations. And part of what charity water needs to also do is then strengthen those bonds by saying, hey, here's the work that's being done by these other NGOs, these other organizations that are already on the ground, and they know how to navigate that terrain politically, in terms of culture, all that stuff, and shine a light on the work that their partners are doing. Tell their partner stories. And so by telling the partner stories, they also lift and elevate the charity water story. So that's an example of where telling partner stories and working cooperatively, I think, can be helpful. Now, to their credit, from what I understand, and this was a criticism years ago as well, it seems like they're, because it's sort of the spotlight has been on them for a while, they seem to have kind of raised the bar and be much more mindful about the way that they go into organizations and the way they go into these countries, and they're much more cooperative about that. But that's a really important part of nonprofit storytelling. Who are your partners? How can you work collaboratively with them? What are they doing to help you to fight the larger fight? You're all on the same side. And how can you shed a light on their issues as well and elevate sort of the entire discussion?
That's a good point, Kathy. That's also another way that advocacy happens for nonprofits.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. A lot of nonprofits align with profitable ventures.
Mm-hmm.
I worked with Taco Bell for a while, and they do a lot with Boys and Girls Clubs.
Mm-hmm.
And they're really sort of for me, they're the gold standard. Taco Bell and Boys and Girls Club, that partnership is really the gold standard in that Taco Bell created a division within their company to work directly with Boys and Girls Club. They didn't just take it on, for promotional purposes or affinity. They really worked it. And I would suggest to any nonprofit, there are a lot of companies that can give you awareness, free advertising, but there's a difference between that and a company helping you to make the most of your cause.
Yeah.
And I think in interviewing companies, it's important to know and to get a commitment from them as to what, in fact, they will help you to do.
Yeah.
Which is another
promote.
which is another great story, Jim. right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's
Yeah.
That's a really, really, actually really important point, because it seemed, over the years, I'm sure we've all seen it, where it starts out as a really sort of great, private, public sector kind of relationship, and it looks from the outside, oh, this might be a marriage that actually works, and you may have an imbalance or just an asymmetry of long-term goals, and then what ends up happening is that at some point that nonprofit kind of loses its story. It gets a little maybe submerged in the bigger corporate narrative, and then what happens if that relationship dissolves? A lot of times the nonprofit then doesn't have a story that they're telling cohesively separately from that. Mm-hmm. And I've seen that happen, and it's really a shame. And so, is there a way to maybe think about those types of partnerships and partnership stories? Like, how would you tell a story, where it looks balanced and it looks co-branded, so it doesn't become part of the company social responsibility narrative,
I'm not sure I know what you mean.
Well, for example, Wendy's does a lot with adoption, because Dave Thomas was adopted as a child. So they do a lot with adoption, but it's funny because they don't tell you a lot of the organizations they work with, and those people who are benefiting maybe monetarily aren't benefiting from the press and the publicity, because you don't hear the names of those agencies. You just hear Wendy's. It becomes Wendy's social responsibility, and so that's what I'm referring to. Yeah. Well,
definitely there has to be a commitment, and I think that it behooves the nonprofit to spell it out, and to get it in writing, and to help them to understand, because they're benefiting. The profit, for-profit companies benefiting. They're benefiting from the association. So it's a two-way street, and there has to be a commitment. Now, on the other hand, I think it behooves the profit company, and I've seen this, and in fact, I've been on the other side of this, where charity, not to be mentioned, not to be named, but we were involved with them, and then all of a sudden, all the rules came out. We can't do this, and you can't do that, and shame on me and us, because we really didn't go. We didn't ask the right questions when we aligned with them, and we found out too late that what we had in mind was something that we couldn't do. So again, there's got to be a lot of conversation in forming these partnerships from both parties.
Right. Yeah. Can you think of a successful? I'm just thinking of a successful example of something that has worked, where it's been sort of where I think the nonprofit was elevated and really benefited long-term from that relationship. But I'm trying to think of something that has. And
well, the one that comes to mind, it's just kind of an unfair example, is Ronald McDonald. But actually Ronald McDonald is a separate organization apart from McDonald's. I mean, they have their own board of directors, their own, but they are affiliated, and they have an organic relationship, I guess, but one that was formed outside of the corporate structure. I'm trying to think. I can't think of any offhand.
It's a good example of longevity, though, in terms of a nonprofit, because everybody knows Ronald McDonald House. That's such a well-known. And it's had staying power. That's really a well-known nonprofit story.
Right.
Well, what makes we talk a lot about the different types of stories to be told in the nonprofit arena, the donor stories, obviously the constituent stories. There's the partner stories. And of course, then there's the long-term, here's who we are, here's our strategy, here's how we're actively managing the strategy in the world story. Are there things that maybe differ from business storytelling in terms of the elements of great storytelling? When we dissect a nonprofit story, what has to be there? I think there's some things we probably would all agree on, but maybe there's some things there that we should rethink.
Well, the biggest difference that I see, and I'd be curious to see hear what Jim has to say too, but for me, the biggest difference between a business story and a nonprofit story is that the end user, the people who receive the services of the nonprofit, they're different than consumers, right? So they need to be handled and treated with great care, because usually they are receiving the services of a nonprofit because they need the additional help, they need the leg up, they need the whatever it is that the nonprofit is helping them with. And one of the nonprofits that I work with here in San Diego is Just in Time for Foster Youth.
Oh, wow.
So these are foster youth who've emancipated from the system. So they're in their early 20s. And now what? You know, when you emancipate from the foster care system, you're given basically a black trash bag with all of your belongings and, you know, hey, have a good life.
Yeah.
And so this agency is one of several in the county that sort of steps in and helps these young people get stabilized and what have you. And so I help these young people share their story for either advocacy purposes, for fundraising purposes, or to help them have a voice. Mm-hmm. And the things that they've been through are horrific.
Oh,
absolutely. Yeah. Amen.
And so how do you actually start working with someone like that to have them tell their story and do it in a way that really serves them and doesn't pimp them out, right?
Yeah.
It's tricky because there's a lot of sensitivity.
Right.
I think one of the first things you have to do is win their trust. And one of the ways you do that is by saying, hey, look, you know, before I release anything, you're going to be able to see this.
Right.
As opposed to try to hide the content from them.
Right.
Share it with them and, you know, and allow them to comment on it. And, you know, and give them the choice of answering whatever questions they want to answer. I mean, they don't have to tell you everything. They can just tell you what they want to tell you. And to allow them that freedom, I think, is important.
Right. I think that's true. And that's what I've learned is that their relationship to their own story could be raw, somewhat resolved, or very resolved. And part of my work as the business storyteller, you know, helping them share their story is helping them find the best way that they can tell their story, revealing whatever it is that they want or are comfortable revealing. Right? So we don't have to get into all of the, you know, things that happened, right? We can craft a story that's just as powerful that respects them and what they want to say. So it just is coming in, I think, with that sensitivity and knowing that it is going to be different. You're going to have to employ some different skills.
So Karen, I have a question. When you work with this organization, are you the primary story gatherer, or do you work with people within the organization to help them gather stories as well?
I prefer to help them become good story gatherers because they have the direct relationship with the people that they serve. And so what we do is we go through and I teach them how to identify story stars, right? And someone can be a story star that is new to the organization, hasn't really received all of the benefits that other people have. So their story is maybe a little more raw than others. But the thing that we look for is their story a powerful story? And can they speak about it well, wherever they are at that particular point? And then once they identify their story stars, and some are more, you know, better presenters than others, it doesn't really matter, but then they send them to me and then I work with them from there. And we find them places to share their story if that's what they'd like. So.
Yeah, I think it's really important to engage the organization in story gathering as well as story sharing.
Right.
You know, and I don't think it has to be that tough. You know, a lot of people think storytellers are performers. They don't necessarily have to.
I've never heard that one coming from you. Never.
Right.
Yeah. So, you know, it's a matter of just, you know, giving them a number of scenarios, you know, maybe even a form that they can fill out. And there's other ways to share. You can do it, you know, via audio and put it on the, you know, database, or it can be in writing. And, you know, have their establish an archive, if you will, for people to access when in fact they need stories. And, with anybody within the organization can use stories.
Absolutely.
And the problem is that they don't have them at their disposal.
Right.
But if they had a place to access them from other members within the organization, it would be a lot easier.
Well, story banking. Story banking is what you're talking about.
Exactly.
And I agree. You have to have a sort of a central repository. And I love the idea, which, you were alluding to, I think both of you, which is, let people tell it their way. So maybe it's, some people are further along in their journey, so they're going to tell it in a different way. Preserve the dignity of your constituents by letting them tell it in the best way, that whatever medium or manner suits their journey and brings dignity to it, because the whole point of doing this is to help people. And I know you're both with me because you're both storytellers. There's nothing that just gets my ire going than bad nonprofit asking, where the dignity of the person I feel has been compromised, and I just hate that. The pander, the pimping, and then asking for money. And I know you need money, and I want to help, but I just question the manner in which they've served up the story, and if it hasn't compromised maybe the journey or the identity or the feelings of the person being sort of put up on the end. And so I think you're right. There has to be a sensitivity about the way that
when did you start using heroin?
Exactly. Right. Exactly.
I know. Exactly. When I do it, one of the first things I always do with my nonprofits is I walk them through a model. And the model is basically this.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Well, when you meet somebody, right, you start sharing stories, and you might invite them up onto your front porch, right?
Yeah.
And so you feel comfortable sharing only certain kinds of stories at that point, because you don't really know them that well, right? So you're on the front porch. Now the relationship continues, it gets a little deeper, and so you invite them into the living room. Now you start hearing living room stories. A few more intimate details are being shared, right? Yeah. And then if the relationship continues and you
end up in the bedroom?
No, you end up in the kitchen.
I just wondered.
That's a whole other blab.
Right.
That's a story.
So. But then you're in the kitchen, and you're around the kitchen table, and you're sharing kitchen table stories, which is where the most intimate details, right?
That's a great way to put it. I love that. That's great.
Yeah, and oftentimes what we do sort of unconsciously when we're evoking stories in nonprofits is we have a front porch relationship, and we ask for kitchen table stories.
Yeah. Very good. Yes, that's absolutely right.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So we have to remember that and pay attention to the relationships that we have and see what's really appropriate.
Yeah,
that's so important. I love that analogy. I think it's a great analogy, and it is as Rich is saying. Thank you, Rich. It's a great analogy, and it's about relationships, as you're preserving the relationship as well. And I can't help but think that part of the storytelling, and if you've done your job right as a nonprofit, you then have turned people from being on the donation receiving to being an empowered advocate. So, so when you can actually empower the constituents and help them make that transition to be part of their own agency and exercise their own agency, those also are really empowering stories, because then you become sort of an empowering agency versus a pimping agency. I mean, we need to tell those stories, but I think there's a way to tell it, and there's a way to help people make that journey.
Yes.
And telling those stories about how somebody has exercised their own agency and grown. Those are really important follow-up stories, I think, that maybe nonprofits don't do enough and should.
Right. I agree. One of the most common objections I get when I work with nonprofits and the people who they've helped, when I'm helping those people tell their stories, is that they hesitate to tell their story because they're afraid, once they tell their story, of the questions that people will ask afterwards.
Yeah.
Questions that are too intrusive. And they don't know how to handle that because they don't want to share those intimate details, right? But that's often what somebody from the audience who doesn't know them will come up and ask for, right? Or tell me about the abuse that, tell me all about that.
Yeah.
And so I always teach them a little story Aikido, so that when they encounter that situation, they know how to handle it. Right?
Indeed.
And it's basically just to say that, well, obviously in your story, you triggered something in that person who is listening. And they're just not very good at trying to figure out what it was that triggered them, and they're not too clear about how to ask those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
So instead of answering the questions that they do ask that you find intrusive, just say, oh, I think something really happened in the story that for you, and what was that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that helps them when you're talking about being empowered, right?
Yeah.
It helps them feel so much more empowered with their own story. And so we often forget that back end.
Definitely. We've got two really good comments. I want to read those because they're really great. First from Lynn Davis. Thank you, Lynn. She says, very true, Karen, but I think about the guy who runs Humans of New York.
Yes.
What a great storytelling organization. Humans of New York, and how he is able to get stories out of people. You're absolutely right on. He does an amazing job. They feel really heard. People feel really heard, and they don't feel judged. And I think one of the ways he's able to do that is there's no judgment. There's no filter. It's just, getting people to tell their stories. And then Sally, I think it would be interesting, if challenging, maybe to talk about telling the story of systemic issues as opposed to individual problem and successes. That's a really great kind of question and comment.
Yeah.
And so maybe let's segue there. And Lynn, you're right about the Humans of New York. Let's segue there. I think that's a very interesting dynamic that she's talking about. So the reason we have people that we have to help in a lot of these nonprofits is because we have systemic economic inequality, and we have a growing disparity between the people at the 1% and the 99%. So that's a great point. So how do you tell them the story of these big systemic divides? Rather than, and I think it's a double-edged sword, and I'm going to step in here while we're all kind of mulling it over, because part of, I think, the reason you tell individual problems and successes, as we all know, is because it humanizes the issue. If I talk about income disparity, I could talk about it till the cows come home, but it doesn't mean anything until I actually put faces to the actual issue.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I think you have to. I don't know if you can really come right out and editorialize about a systemic issue as much as you can infer that there's a systemic issue through the story you tell about the people it's affecting. To your point, Kathy, I think that if the less humanizing it is, or the less emotionally moving it's going to be. I think people are already inundated with opinions and pundits, about systemic issues within this country. What the nonprofits can benefit from is showing the effects of those issues on various people.
Absolutely.
But I think another way to think about it is collective storytelling. And so this is where you have a whole body of stories that collectively speak to the entire issue. And I think this is what happened with MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. Story after story after story. They were all different, but they all spoke to the same issue.
Exactly right.
And that's how we ended up with a collective response to this issue. And so it's about visibility over time, I think.
Well, and I think it's about making sure that there's a consistent storyline.
Right.
Again, it's up to leadership to say, okay, these are the kinds of stories we're looking for. Stories that, show how we work, stories that show the benefits that people have from our support, both whatever. They really have to be well defined, I think, for the leader, or else you're, like you say, you're just going to end up all over the place.
Yeah.
And I think that's what MAD does, by the way.
Yeah, They do a great job. And I'm going to bring Sally on in a second because if she wants to clarify or she has an example to come on, so I'll bring her on in a second. But I did want to make a point because I think, Rich has said a lot of stories speaking to the same issue creates the story mosaic of an organization. Exactly right, which Jim and Karen are both saying. I think that the issue here is to not get fragmented, to make sure that if you are dealing with one issue, you're telling the story in a consistent way so that it doesn't become a bunch of separate stories with no cohesion. So let's bring, hey, Sally, do you want to dial in and maybe give a little clarity and color to the systemic issue that you're talking about? You want to dial in? Go ahead and call in. Is she still there? There's should be a button. I have an open seat here. Go ahead and there you go. You got it. Yeah, they changed. Blab changed the interface every time.
They did.
They did. Yeah. So it's a little trickier. Hey, Sally. I see.
Hey, I'm not really.
There you go.
But,
I see half your head.
Yeah, I'm looking down.
Probably better than no.
So welcome. Can you give us maybe a little bit? You mentioned there was a board of directors or an organization you were working with that had maybe a version of this they were dealing with.
Well, I did this really great workshop with the Frameworks Institute, and I thought they do fabulous stuff because they're all about framing the story before you launch the story. And what I really loved about it was I agree with Jim about how you can go brain dead just hearing about issues.
Yes.
When we talk about social inequality or
it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming. Yeah.
It's overwhelming. And it would be a lot more interesting if we could just have one humanizing event.
Yeah.
But what Frameworks was pointing out, and I found this fascinating, is if you go in for that humanizing event, you can start making it seem like it's an individual problem when what you're really tackling are major social issues. Like racism, like, economic inequality. So what I was provoked to think about is how do we get that framework going so that when we go in for the individual stories, we're not going in like it's all an individual problem.
Well, it's a really great issue. No, you're absolutely right. It reminds me of what happened to Oxfam. If you remember the story of Oxfam, Oxfam used to donate, and people sort of tuned out their message. Then they started sending pictures of little kids and saying, this is so-and-so in this village, and she gets 1 glass of water, and she has to ration that 1 glass of water for a day. And the difference when they anchored it into stories at the human level, the donations went from like down here to way up here.
Yep,
so it reminds me of what you just said, Sally, of that Oxfam success, just simply because they took it from this big problem where people throw their hands up in the air and say, how do I tackle world hunger or water or potable drinking water? I can't possibly make a dent in it. But then if I anchored it through the lens of little people, little kids, I could help, but I actually knew who they were. People went, well, I can do that. I can make a difference for that one person. And I see what you're saying. And I think there's a way to maybe balance it. I don't know.
Well, I think in that example, I think that's a good example of what she was talking about.
Yeah.
I think by doing that, you shed light on the bigger issue.
On the bigger issue,
without preaching about the bigger issue.
Right.
I think some nonprofits have, they're working on a number of different fronts.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So some of the solutions can be a little bit, I don't know if complex is the right word, but varied. Right.
Yeah.
And so what I've seen work in those situations is when the organization is really clear about the 2 or 3 values that they're really wanting to emphasize. That if we focus on the value of community or if we focus on the value of connection, right, a lot of problems get solved. And so the storytelling kind of hits those 2 or 3 values, and it creates more of a cohesive story, like that story mosaic. I love that imagery.
Yeah.
Shared earlier.
Yeah, I think, Frameworks was talking about that, and they added the one piece because they can of doing backup research to figure out from those values, Karen, that you were talking about, which are the ones that people are going to really connect to.
Right.
And testing out the words, testing out the metaphors, coming out with a really strong grouping of metaphors that then they could use as a through line in all of the individual stories.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, Sally. Absolutely.
That totally does. Totally get what you're saying. Absolutely. Absolutely.
In fact, it's a good reference for people, because if you go over to their site with the Frameworks Institute, you can see how they've approached developing the materials for different social causes.
Nice.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye, Sally.
Let me ask you guys this. I have a question. I mean, do you see a lot more storytelling being done by nonprofits, or is it still catch as catch can? I don't see as much as I'd like to. I'd see more, cars for kids. Call this number and donate your car. And I don't even know what they do other than they do something for kids.
It's interesting because I see pockets. And especially because I'm in Silicon Valley, where they're actually taking advantage of the technology that's so pervasive here. That we're in the epicenter of some of the most technically and technologically advanced, companies in the world. And so I'm seeing nonprofits in be more innovative in certain areas. There's still some work to be done with the storytelling piece, like getting all the elements right. But I'm encouraged by, I'm seeing more experimentation, more trying different things, more thinking outside the box in terms of the Silicon Valley Humane Society about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, did something very funny. They started telling. They were having all these dogs that they could not get adopted. And they had this one dog that was biting people, and they just couldn't find a home for it. And they created a whole campaign called Eddie the Terrible. And it got millions of views. And Eddie eventually not only got adopted, but he actually, get this, became a service dog. And this was a dog they could not get adopted because they were very honest. So they said, you know what we're going to do? Here's the way we're going to approach storytelling. Everybody lies on their resume, LinkedIn, everyone's like, yeah, this is the best ever. I'm the best at this. I'm the best at this. Nobody ever says I'm inexperienced. I'm experienced and innovative. And so they said, well, let's tell the truth about this dog. So they started saying, look, if you've got little kids and you want a dog, Eddie is not for you.
Not the one.
Keep walking. Keep walking. If you want a gentle dog that's going to love you back, you will be heavily disappointed. Keep walking. And they just started humanizing Eddie and started, they put him in like a Breaking Bad scenarios, and they put all these images, and they did a whole bunch of campaigns. And the focus, the central tenet of that story was just the truth about this dog. And it got millions of people responded to it. And this was something that they combined the truth of a really good story with all these savvy social media ways of getting the story out. And it was insane. It blew up.
Yeah, that's a great success. Great success. Yeah. I don't know. I see pockets where it's working. I see sometimes too many nonprofits still trying to tell the story of other people and not do it so well, instead of having the people they serve actually tell those stories. And sometimes I also see nonprofits getting too excited about the technology.
Yeah.
And they'll create a digital story that's not well crafted. Yeah. Right. But they got so sucked into, we're going to create a digital story, right?
Yeah.
They forgot the story part.
Yes. Yeah. You need both. You need both.
Yeah. Right. And so it's like the ending is always left off, and so you kind of wonder, okay, well, what happened? What really happened?
We don't know, but we've got a cool infographic about it.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like,
I love that. What was the charity or the nonprofit you were talking about?
It was the Humane Society.
Humane Society.
The Humane Society of Silicon Valley, and it was just, it was insane. They just did a good job.
One of the things I love about that is that it breeds trust. Breeds, pardon the pun, but it does. And today, there are a lot of charities in the news that are, being seen as fraudulent or, spending, 85% of the proceeds on administrative costs and that sort of thing. So, I think all the more reason why something like that is useful, not just for the sake of getting people engaged in what you're all about, but helping them to trust you and to understand and see you as a, you know, an authentic human being, like, you know, and I think a lot of charities need to take that into consideration, especially now with so much scrutiny, being paid on charities.
Yeah. Well, and Sally brings up a point here, which I think goes back to something we talked about earlier, which is partner stories. And she makes a really important comment, which, thank you, Sally. The other thing y'all refer to, she says, is creating coalitions and collaborations between similarly interested nonprofits so they can develop some shared frameworks with which to approach donors. I think you're spot on, because when I think about, and a perfect example of this, sadly, in the world we live in, is when I think about all the gun shootings that have happened. There's all these charities out here reinventing the wheel, and I think if they could pull together their resources, their time, their energy, they're fighting the same battle. Could they, because it's become sadly fragmented, and it's become, and I think that's it's hard to be a lone charity getting attention, but if you took all these partnerships that want the same thing, we want the same outcome, and you combine them, could you maybe approach your story with similar frameworks that benefited everybody?
Amen. Amen. And the other thing, I worked with a coalition, or one that was forming, and it was from a number of real well-known charities who were taking car donations in as a form of donation. And the problem with car donations is that it's really getting a lot of bad press. Yeah. It's probably something you don't read about every day, but if you were to get engaged in that process, you'd find out that there's all kinds of tax loopholes, and, you know, and there are some companies out there that are not very scrupulous, and you really have to be careful. So this coalition got together, and what they decided was that they had a set of rules that you had to abide by in order to be part of this coalition. That it was sort of a credo. That, you know, so much that X% of your dollars are going to go to charity, not administration, that, you know, that you'll report to everyone exactly how the money's being used. And, you know, so it kind of raised the level of responsibility within that space of car donation for these particular charities. And by banding together, they not only gave themselves credibility, but they were also able to give more awareness to the possibility of donating a car to a charity instead of money. So there are probably other opportunities like gun control and other things that people could get involved with that are related and can align together under the same set of rules and or mandates that support their credibility.
You know, I think what we're really talking about, and have been talking about this whole time, is having a story strategy.
Yes.
And really being aware of the different kinds of stories and the different leverage points for story.
Absolutely.
In your nonprofit, and getting your thinking straight about that early on, so that you can move forward with a lot more confidence. And get better results too. No question.
It is having and framing that story strategy. And so there's a lot of parts of that strategy, as we've talked about. What is your main line? What's your framework? How are you going to tie it and humanize it at the individual level? How are you going to tell donor stories? How are you going to honor your constituent stories? How are you going to tell partner stories? So
what is our story?
What is our collective story? And is it a consistent, cohesive mosaic of stories, all pointing towards the same story?
Right. And staff stories and volunteer stories.
Absolutely.
We need to add those into the mix.
Oh, you bet. You bet. The employees I meet, and I'm sure you feel the same way, Jim and Karen, some of the most dedicated, amazing people on the planet. They don't work there because of the money.
No.
These people are dedicated because they believe in the mission, and you will not find some of them, finer people. I have met some of the most amazing people doing this because they truly believe in it. And you don't want to miss out on these people because they are incredible brand and story champions. Right. So in the time we have left, what's one piece of advice that you would really leave people, with this blab on where they could maybe think differently about their nonprofit story that would make a difference moving forward today? Like what's one thing they could do?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is nothing happens until something happens.
Yeah.
And we can talk about the benefits of storytelling till we're blue in the face, but unless leadership somehow latches onto it, it's never going to happen. So somehow organizations, it has to be, I think, I don't think you'll have a hard time convincing anybody below the leadership the importance of storytelling. What you have to do maybe is help management see how in fact it works. How you do that, I don't know. There's, it depends. Everything depends on who you know and what you know. But within the organization, there has to be something that inspires leadership to take advantage of all that storytelling can do, or else it's just never going to happen. Yeah. It's not going to happen.
Agree.
Yeah. I think for me, it's get your heads on straight about what a really good story is.
Yeah.
Right. We want high quality storytelling, particularly at the nonprofit level. I mean, you can't afford to not really be telling great stories. So what makes a great story, and how do you tell it for your nonprofit? What's the best way for you to do that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. I think those are great. And I would say, just to reiterate some of the points we're making in sort of one encapsulation, you have to tell a variety of stories. Every organization does. Nonprofits are no different. And just make sure, as we've been talking about all along today, that you're telling the right different stories, and that it can't be the same story over and over again. And I the poor kind of muscular dystrophy, kind of the Jerry Lewis telethon. And, when you tell the same story over and over and it doesn't look like you're having successes tackling the problem, then you fall into this trap of, well, where are the success stories? It's been going on for 30 or 40 years. Have we made a dent in this? And I think, they've been under a little bit of a scrutiny because of that. And I think that sometimes you really need to look at the story from a lot of different angles. Are we telling all the pieces of the story? Everybody has a puzzle piece to that story, and make sure that you're looking at all the possibilities, I think, is really the issue there.
Yeah. So good points. Good points from both of you. Just love it.
Yeah, no, thank you. Stories of possibility, not problems. Thank you, Rich. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Sally and Lynn and everybody, your questions are amazing. And I want to give a shout out to Karen. Karen she's the author of Business Storytelling for Dummies. It is a great book, and she is the founder of Just Story It. And then we've got Jim Signorelli. I'm so glad you finally were able to do it. And Jim is the author of Story Branding, and it is a fabulous book. And I love the book before I even met Jim, so that was a bonus for me to actually meet him. And his website is story-lab.net, correct?
Correct.
All right. Well, wonderful. And I am Kathy Klotz-Guest. I am your host, and I'm the founder of keepingithuman.com, bringing improvisation and storytelling together in business. Yes, they can coexist. Thank you, everybody, for a wonderful blab. And this recording it'll be up for 24 hours, and then I'll go ahead and promote the recording after the 24 hours, and you guys can use it in your marketing. I'll tag it and all that good stuff. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care, everybody.